Do you ever buy something at a thrift store that turns out to be cursed? No. Well, me neither. But this happened to Julia. Julia was a young woman who lived alone in a big city. She loved thrift stores because you could find such unique things, and one day she found an old painting. It was of a child with sad eyes. At least she thought they were sad. Maybe they were just tired eyes. Either way, Julia couldn't take her eyes off of them, so she bought the painting and took it home. That night she heard crying coming from her room. She sat up in bed and listened. The crying seemed to be coming from the painting. Julia wasn't scared, so much as confused. Crying, she assumed, was just a part of the painting. Sort of like the cracking paint and the way the artist had misspelled the word childhood. Still, she didn't want to listen to crying in the middle of the night, so she got up and walked into her living room. There was the painting on the wall, and the crying was definitely coming from it. So Julia did what any reasonable person would do. She took the painting off the wall, walked into her bedroom, threw the painting onto her bed, and curled up with a good book and went to sleep. The next morning, Julia woke up, sat up in bed and looked over at the painting. It was now sitting in the corner. At first, Julia thought she must have taken it off the wall in her sleep. But then she remembered the crying and how she couldn't bring herself to listen to it. Again, she didn't want to hear the crying again, but maybe throwing the painting away would help. So she got out of bed, walked over to the painting, looked at it for a moment, then walked out of the house and threw the painting in the garbage can across the street. She returned home later that evening. She walked in, flipped on the light, and walked into her living room, and there it was, the painting on her wall. It was slightly crooked. Now, if Julia believed in God, she would have asked him or her why the painting kept reappearing on her wall. But Julia didn't believe in God. Instead, she decided the painting must have valuable material underneath the surface, so it was worth more than she thought. Someone had obviously taken the painting off the wall and put it back before she bought it. The next morning, Julia woke up and went to her living room. She looked at the painting. The child in it looked older, his hair longer, his clothes more worn, his eyes angrier. But it was still just a painting, right? Still, she couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. So she grabbed the painting and headed to the kitchen. She propped it open like a door and hid behind it. Every time she heard a noise, she jumped. After a while, she heard a voice coming from the painting. It said, "Let me out." Startled, Julia dropped the painting. It landed on the floor, but it wasn't the sound of the painting hitting the floor that made her run. It was the sound of the voice. It said it again. "Let me out." This time it was louder. Julia ran out of the front door, down the sidewalk and around the corner. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to see what was coming out of the painting. She continued running until she reached a park. She walked over to a random painting on a random wall and stood under it. Safe. Or maybe not safe. Because as soon as she stopped running, she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy footsteps. They sounded like metal moans. She closed her eyes and counted to 10. Then she opened her eyes and turned around. Nothing was there. Julia started to relax, but then she heard the voice again. It said, "Let me out." It was closer now. Julia spun around, but all she saw was a little boy with sad eyes looking at her. "Let me out," he said. His voice was raspy and sad. "Please, let me out." Julia stared at the boy for a moment, then screamed and ran as fast as she could. She ran and she ran, but the sound of his footsteps behind her grew louder and louder, and the sound of his voice echoed in her ears. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!"